All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're going to question one of the most important financial documents you'll ever sign, your mortgage note. See, you probably think it's just a simple promise to pay back a loan. But what if I told you that according to federal law, it might be something, well, something much, much more complicated? I want you to think back to that moment you signed the papers for your home. You signed a promissory note, right? But what did you actually create in that moment? Was it just a simple IOU between you and your lender? Or did you, without even knowing it, create a powerful financial instrument that was about to take a journey deep into the federal banking system? For most of us, a promissory note is basically a fancy IOU. It's simple. I borrow money and I promise to pay it all back, plus interest. It feels like a straightforward two-party deal, just you and the lender. That's the common understanding, and honestly, it's how these things are treated almost all the time. And that common understanding? Well, it's actually baked right into our legal system. See, courts usually start with what's called a judicial presumption. They just assume your note is a basic contract. It's kind of like the default setting, the legal shortcut that gets a foreclosure case moving. And from that point on, the whole case proceeds as if it's just a simple matter of a broken promise. And right here, this is where we see the two worlds collide. On one side, you have the simple IOU, a private promise governed by basic contract law. But on the other side is a totally different beast, a security. That's a tradable financial instrument. It involves investors, markets, and a whole web of complex federal regulations. The whole argument we're digging into today is that your note isn't that simple thing on the left. It's actually the complex thing on the right. So here's the challenge to the status quo. There's a powerful legal argument that says this whole judicial presumption is just flat out wrong. And look, this isn't based on some clever, tricky interpretation. It's an argument that claims to be rooted directly in federal statutes. Yep, actual laws passed by Congress that seem to define these notes in a radically different way. The key that unlocks this entire argument is a term you've probably never heard before: eligible paper. This comes straight from the Federal Reserve Act. It's a label for certain financial instruments, including our promissory notes, that banks can deposit at the Federal Reserve to use as collateral. Think of it like a five-star asset the bank can trade in to get cash. The critical point here is that your note has the potential to become this eligible paper. And that, of course, leads to the big question. So what? What actually happens when your simple little promise to pay gets this fancy official designation? Does it really change anything? Well, according to this legal framework, it changes absolutely everything. Okay, so let's follow the evidence. We're not going to talk about opinions or theories here. We're going to look at what are called statutory facts, the specific language that Congress actually wrote into law. This is where the argument really gets its teeth. So just how strong is this evidence? Well, it all circles back to this number, 12. The argument goes that in the Banking Act of 1933 and other related laws, Congress refers to notes that qualify as eligible paper as securities 12 separate times. Not once, not twice, a full dozen times. That's a pretty bold claim. And the foundation for this argument isn't some obscure legal footnote. We are talking about the heavy hitters of American financial legislation: the Federal Reserve Act, the Banking Act of 1933, and specific sections of the U.S. Code that are the bedrock of our central banking system. So let's trace this alleged journey your note takes. Step 1, you sign it. Easy enough. Step 2, the lender doesn't just stick it in a filing cabinet, they deposit it at a Federal Reserve Bank. Step 3, boom, it's now officially classified as eligible paper. And here's the kicker, step 4, the argument is that the law says the obligation itself, your promise to pay, transfers. It becomes an obligation of the Federal Reserve. Now this all hinges on another key concept: being deposited at par. At par is just a fancy way of saying at full face value. The claim is that when the bank deposits your note, they get its entire value from the Federal Reserve System, right then and there. So that raises a pretty big question, doesn't it? If the lender has already been paid in full, is the original debt technically satisfied? And again, this isn't just an interpretation. Proponents pull this directly from the text of the law itself. This quote from a 1945 statute seems pretty darn clear. It says, "These notes shall be the obligations of the Federal Reserve Bank procuring the same." Now, in legalese, shall isn't a suggestion. It's a command. This points to a direct legal transfer of that obligation. So if all of this statutory evidence is out there, why isn't this a slam dunk case in court? Well, This is where the story takes a sharp turn, from financial regulations to fundamental constitutional rights. The claim is that the justice system itself is set up to prevent this evidence from ever seeing the light of day. To really get the constitutional stakes, you need to know this term, exculpatory evidence. It's any evidence that could prove a defendant isn't guilty, or in a civil case like a foreclosure, show they don't have an obligation anymore. The right to present your own exculpatory evidence is like a cornerstone of American justice. In this slide really illustrates the core grievance. On one side of the courtroom, you have the creditor, who's allowed to move forward based on nothing more than an unsupported presumption that the note is a simple contract. But when the homeowner tries to present their evidence, the actual text from federal laws, it's allegedly shut down, excluded. One side's assumption is treated as fact, while the other side's facts are treated as irrelevant. This alleged imbalance leads to claims of two massive constitutional violations. First, a denial of due process, which means you could lose your property without ever being allowed to present your full legally valid defense. And second, a denial of equal protection, arguing the law isn't being applied fairly to everybody in the room. Let's just quickly break those down. The due process claim is pretty straightforward. How can you possibly have a fair hearing if you're not allowed to use the very laws that Congress passed to govern the issue? And the equal protection claim is all about fairness. Why should one party's baseless assumption get more respect in court than the other party's fact-based statutory argument? These are really serious accusations against the judicial process. When you boil it all down, it comes to this fundamental question about the hierarchy of law. What should be more powerful? A simple assumption made by a court, or a fact established by an act of Congress? The whole argument is that a fact written into federal law should always trump a convenient legal shortcut. And that's what we'll leave you with. It's a question that really strikes at the heart of how our government is supposed to work. If a law, passed by Congress and signed into law, explicitly defines a financial instrument in one way, should a court have the power to just ignore that and presume it's something else entirely? That's the question this whole legal challenge forces all of us to confront.